Shalom, welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Chabados of Delmar, together with my co-host Mark Ronich of Statewide News Service and jbiztechvalley.com. We have a very, very special guest with us, Professor Timothy Lytton. Welcome, Tim, to the Jewish View.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, we're not here to talk about law, even though I'd love to, about comparing law with Jewish law. But Tim is an author. You see that there's the book Kosher and Private Regulation in the Age of Industrial Food. So,
Tim, why did you write the book? Why did you feel there was a need to write this book?
I'm generally interested in the issue of non-governmental alternatives to regulation. So there are a lot of different examples of this. For example, most of the fire safety certification of the products in your home, your toaster oven or your appliances or the wiring in this building are all privately certified. They're not government certified.
That's UL.
That's right, the
United
Underwriters
Labs.
Laboratories, et cetera. Intertech is another one. Most of our food safety systems are private food safety systems. So I was looking around for a good example of private regulation that is a non-governmental form of regulation. And I wanted to find an example that worked especially well, because a lot of the examples that one finds don't work so well, for example, in food safety. And so the example that I came across was the kosher certification system. And it turns out that the U.S. kosher certification system is probably one of the best examples of successful private regulation in terms of its reliability and consumer protection.
So in the book, you talk about from the 1800s, and you talk about how there was a lot of fraud going on in the 1800s. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, one of the things that makes the kosher certification story such an interesting story is that the history of kosher actually involves an enormous amount of fraud and corruption. And the course of cleaning up that fraud and corruption tells us a lot about how it is you could improve a private regulatory system. So if you go back to the origins of kosher certification in the United States, originally in the United States, there was only one synagogue in each town. So each major city had only one community. So New York had its congregation, Charleston had its congregation, Boston had its congregation. And that congregation hired a ritual slaughterer for the meat. So all of the kosher meat certification in that town was supervised by a single authority, and that was the congregation in the town. And that system really was inherited from Europe, where it existed for 1,000 years, where
Now
there was
we're talking about 18 what?
We're talking about as early as the 1700s.
1700s.
The earliest records we have of kosher certification and slaughter in the United States go back to the 1700s, in the colonial era.
Right.
And traditionally in Europe and in North Africa, in traditional Jewish communities, there was what was called the Kehillah, or Community Council, and the Kehillah, or Community Council, would hire and supervise the ritual slaughterers for that community, and there would be no one else. There would be no competition. So that system was brought over to America, and instead of a Kehillah or Community Council, we had congregations. This system was generally quite reliable. If the ritual slaughterer or shochet wasn't doing his job particularly well, or there was any whiff of problems or fraud, they would essentially reprimand him, or they would fire him and they would replace him. The system broke down in 1813. In 1813, the congregation of Shearei Yisrael, which was the single congregation, the only congregation in the city of New York, wanted to dismiss its ritual slaughterer named Jacob Abrahams. Jacob Abrahams had some problems, and the congregation didn't like him very much, and so the elders of the congregation basically fired him. And he went out and he made an agreement with a bunch of local butchers to sell his meat as kosher. And the congregational authorities went to the City Council of New York, and they filed a petition, and they said, this can't be done. We are the sole kosher authority in the City of New York, and we need the City of New York to pass an ordinance to make it such that we have an exclusive license to allow people to sell kosher meat. So the City of New York passed an ordinance, and it said that if you're not certified by Shearei Yisrael, you may not sell your meat as kosher. Well, Jacob Abrahams did what many of us now refer to as lawyering up. He found a number of allies in the congregation, and he went with those allies, those lawyers, to the City Council of New York, and he said, this is not Europe. You can't do this. We have freedom of religion and we have freedom of commerce in the United States, and anybody who wants to buy my meat as kosher in America is entitled to do so. And the City Council reversed itself. And this was the birth of what we would call a new institution, which is the independent shochet. This is the first time that a shochet that slaughtered meat and labeled it kosher in a community did not work for the community. He worked now as an independent contractor, and he was paid directly by the butcher or by the owner of the meat. And this, of course, creates a terrible conflict of interest. because the owner of the meat and the butcher have a great interest in making sure that the meat they sell is kosher because they get a premium for kosher meat. And if there's some question as to its kosher status, they might be not so concerned about consumer protection as they are about their profit margin, and they might pressure the ritual slaughterer to go ahead and certify the meat as kosher anyway.
And
this is a big problem, and this conflict of interest grew starting in 1813 and became an enormous problem throughout the city of New York and the United States from then on.
And in this day and age, that's the more modern day issue with that is Hebrew National, from what I understand, because Hebrew National pays their own, not slaughterer, but their own certification, their own mishkiach.
Well, the system that we currently have is a system that evolved out of the old system, and the system we have now is a system of private independent certification agencies, and Hebrew National's meat is certified by a private independent certification agency called the Triangle K.
Oh, because that's how the expression, we answer to a higher authority, came in, because they said, we don't have to answer to these councils, we have to answer to a higher
Well,
authority.
actually, that's not the case.
No.
Hebrew National has always been certified by an outside certifier. It used to be an individual rabbi who provided certification, and now
it's paid by Hebrew National.
That's right, and now it's a
rabbi.
certification agency, the Triangle K, which is also paid. So the system in America is one of agencies. The problem of the independent shochet basically created widespread fraud, and the fraud became so bad that by the 19-teens, by about 1915, 1920, the city of New York estimated that about 50% of the meat that was sold as kosher in the city of New York was actually non-kosher, which is a tremendous rate of fraud. If you think of going in and you have a 50% chance of what you're buying is not what it is that they're supposedly selling you, it's a huge problem. And it was a problem that was so big, we're talking about a consumer market of 1.4 million consumers and over 800 congregations, that the system of congregational control was long broken down. The city and the state of New York tried to inspect meat and certify kosher meat, but they had a handful of inspectors and they couldn't possibly cover such a huge market. And as a result, there was rampant and widespread fraud. Private rabbis got into the business and they were selling their certifications to the highest bidder, and of course the meat owners and the butchers were in cahoots. And the problem became so big that nobody could rely on kosher certification in the city of New York.
And not just there, I mean, in Albany here, in the 1880s to 1920, we had 3 Orthodox synagogues, and Pearl Street, South Pearl Street, was all kosher butchers and bakeries, and we had a lively community here.
That's right. There was a significant kosher market
Here
in the city of Albany. I don't know whether anybody's actually kept tabs on what the level of fraud was, but we know that from New York City that the level was quite high. The other thing to keep in mind in terms of the story of kosher is that fraud was really just the tip of the iceberg. One of the top 3 areas of organized crime and corruption in the United States was kosher meat.
Really?
In the turn of the century. John Dewey, who was eventually the governor of the state of New York and ran for the presidency against Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was originally the district attorney in Manhattan, and one of the top 3 organized crime problems he had was kosher meat. It got so bad that in around 1906, there was a group called the Live Poultry Commission Merchants Kosher Association. And this trade association fixed prices for kosher poultry, and they told retailers, if you buy kosher poultry from anyone else, we're going to set up stores and drive you out of business, and we may break your kneecaps. People ended up in the East River with cement shoes on, and there was no way that they could prosecute these people because no one would turn state's evidence, until a single retailer named Bernie Baff, turned state's evidence in 1911, and they used his testimony to convict and to lock up all of these Poultry Merchants Association gangsters. And it turns out that 3 years after he turned state's evidence, his car was bombed, his house was firebombed, his chickens were poisoned, his horses were poisoned. And by about 1914, he was gunned down in broad daylight in the Washington poultry markets in New York City in a drive-by shooting.
And no one saw anything.
And nobody said anything in the middle of the day. And after 3 years, they couldn't solve the murder. It eventually turned out that it wasn't actually the gangsters who did it. It was 100 of his competitors, the rival retailers, the kosher poultry retailers, each ponied up $100 to hire a hitman to kill Bernie Baff, because after he turned state's evidence, he actually turned over and started running the rackets, and he took over poultry distribution.
You see, this is, for New York City, what it was with Capone in Chicago, with the alcohol and running the distilleries illegally. and with prohibition. So, but New York City had this with the kosher meats.
Meat, huh?
Yeah.
That's interesting. I never knew this whole story.
That's right, and the level of
fascinating.
gangsterism in kosher meat and kosher poultry was just a
Now-
top priority for law enforcement.
Why do you think that the kosher food industry didn't just fall apart after all this, and the people said, look, we were eating non-kosher meat, we didn't die from it, we don't need kosher. Why do you think that it stayed together and it just corrected itself and it became more formalized as opposed to just falling apart and people just saying...
Well, the system did break down significantly.
Yeah.
Many, many people stopped buying kosher meat. Many people felt that kosher supervision was really a scam and that it wasn't reliable and that there was no point in following it. And as a result, you had increasing numbers of people, Jews in America, who stopped keeping kosher. They came from the old country. They would have never thought in Europe or in North Africa of ever eating food that was not certified kosher. They came to America and they figured they couldn't trust it, so they stopped eating kosher meat. And so there was actually a huge decline in kosher meat. But one of the things that happens at this same period is, leaving meat aside for a moment, is there's a huge demand for a new type of food product, and that's the industrially produced food product. So just like in the general food system, in the kosher food system, increasing numbers of people at the turn of the century realize that they want to spend less time in the kitchen, and they want to be able to provide prepared foods, and they want to do it quickly. And the way to do that is to buy packaged foods. Canned foods, packaged foods, all of these things start to come. And just like the American economy in general is industrializing, the American food system is industrializing. And with the rise of industrial food, canned foods and packaged foods, comes a demand for kosher certification of those products. And that's a new kind of kosher certification. And that's where the birth of a new kosher institution in America takes place, which never existed before in Europe or in North Africa, in the old country. And that's the privately owned, independent kosher certification agency, which is what we have now.
And we have, what, about 33, 35 different...
We have 300 independent kosher certifiers
that's
in the
right.
United States and
I
about
left the
1,000
zero, I
world-
left the zero off.
1,000 worldwide. So it's actually a very large number. It's a very robust certification
And how does
industry.
anyone know which one to trust or which one? I mean, and we have locally here in the Albany area, the Vada Kashrut, and that when they have a symbol on a product, how does people from out of the area know to trust that as opposed to something that's more national, as opposed to OU, Chaf-K, other types of symbols?
So that's exactly the question that the kosher certifiers were asking when they started trying to figure out how they could clean up this business and provide reliable certification for this new industrial food supply. And there's an entrepreneur and a particularly important figure in the history of kosher named Rabbi Alexander Rosenberg. He took over the relatively, at the time, small Orthodox Union Kosher Certification Service, which had been founded in the 1920s, but by 1950 was growing. He took it over. It was a relatively small operation with a handful of certification accounts, and he figured out a new business model. He went out to major food companies, Procter & Gamble, Duncan Hines, Campbell's, and he said to them, I have a deal for you. If you get kosher certification, I can increase your sales. They said, how's this possible? There aren't that many kosher consumers who want our products. He said, it's not about the number of kosher consumers. Here's how it works. Kosher consumers are concentrated in key retail markets for food. Brooklyn, North Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, Miami, Baltimore, Houston. And in those markets, if you get kosher certification, your sales will go up among those key kosher consumers. And once your sales go up in those key markets, they will move your product in those key markets from the bottom of the shelf to the middle of the shelf. And the name of the game in food sales is shelf position. If you want to know, you want to buy a cake mix and you go to the supermarket, you don't know what to buy, you're not looking at the ground in the bottom corner. You're looking in the middle of the aisle at 5'5". And what's going to happen is when you get kosher certification in Brooklyn and Chicago and LA and Atlanta and Houston and Baltimore, they're going to move your product to center of the aisle, 5'5". And that's exactly what happened. And when Duncan Hines got kosher certification from the Orthodox Union in the 1950s, their product was moved in those key markets, and once it was moved in those key markets, it was moved across the country. And in 2 months, their market share went up 40%.
Really incredible.
So it was incredible.
Now, before that, though, in 1920, the very first product to get an OU certification was Heinz.
I believe that Heinz, one of the Heinz products.
Right. But, yeah, it was baked. Well, it says here, 1919, the first kosher product came into existence. It was Heinz vegetarian baked beans. There was a man who worked for Heinz who kept kosher who said, let's put an O with the U in the center. First, they were going to write kosher, but then they thought that it would turn some people away. So the man thought that putting the symbol OU on the packaging, the Jews would know what it meant, and the non-Jews would think it was just another symbol on the package that they didn't need to know about. And we learned that at Kosher Fest.
Right.
Which is, you spoke at Kosher Fest, so that's how that was brought up there. And that's,
it's interesting. I've dealt with a few kosher supervisions, and they say, it's grown. You're talking about the beginning, the fetus of the beginning, the birth of kosher and certification. But now it's grown to such a level where it says anything that could be kosher is kosher. The industrial market is almost looking, instead of going, begging
Oh,
them.
for sure. There's tremendous demand in the industrial marketplace for kosher supervision. You cannot bring a major food product out today without kosher supervision. You're immediately writing off 1.5% to 2% of the food market for your product.
And then I heard that the people, even though, like Mark is correct, people say kosher, who knows, they don't want to put it on, but there's many the non-Jewish people who want to see that kosher symbol in a way that it's interesting. We're in the 21st century, go back to the 20th century, because they hear there's poison products in China, and in Europe they used to, just had recently the mad cow disease. So just on a graph, I saw a graph all of a sudden from the kosher when after mad cow I don't want to eat a horse. These non-Jewish people are saying, so at least kosher, I know it's not going to be horse meat.
That's
so
right.
More and more, even though we're sophisticated in 21st century, there's still problems with the food, and even the non-Jewish person knows you're getting, like, is a higher authority, or at least not only government, but you have some rabbi that's looking at it and being sure that they're not.
But even in this day and age, even in Rockland County, like 10 years ago, maybe it was, where the person was convicted of selling chickens as kosher, and then it was non-kosher, and it was in Muncie. In Rockland. Do you remember this story? And was that part of what you wrote about? Did you reference that at all?
That's a retail butcher shop, and my book deals more with industry.
Industrial, right.
And packaged
right.
foods. And I think I want to just pick up on something Rabbi Simon mentioned, which is
sure,
that
so,
kosher is really used as a proxy by many consumers for something other than kosher purity. It's used for health concerns or for lactose intolerant people who are looking for dairy-free items that are labeled parv. And one of the things to keep in mind is that kosher today is actually a very big business. It's a $12 billion kosher consumer market. There are 12 million kosher consumers in the United States, and only 8% of them are religious Jews who keep kosher all the time. The vast majority of kosher consumers are not religious Jews. They're people who see kosher as a symbol of reliability, that they're looking for a healthier product, they're looking for a more nutritious product, they're looking for a safer product, all of the things that you mentioned, or they have other dietary restrictions like Seventh-day Adventists or Muslims who are relying on the kosher symbol. And the reliance on that kosher symbol is really, it's a $12 billion a year industry, and so it's grown enormously far beyond its sort of origins in consumer protection for the Jewish community.
The Maxwell House story was fascinating when they talked about that at Kosher Fest, because people didn't know coffee beans, whether that was a Passover, whether that was kosher for Passover or not. And then they found out that it was. Why is that kosher? Why are coffee beans kosher for Passover?
Because it's interesting. Certain beans people aren't allowed to eat, like peas, for example. On the other hand, because they had them in ancient times, and therefore that they put on a decree that they figured, well, that's too close to the wheat fields, and they just say no beans. But it's something that's very modern, and even though everybody has a coffee today, but it's really fairly modern in the last few hundred years.
Because around 1925, there was a guy, Joseph Jacobs, who worked for the Forward, and he wanted to get ads. So he convinced large companies not only to write cookbooks, but to write ads, and he would put the ads in the newspapers. Well, there was this Colonel Cheek who owned Maxwell House Coffee. And Jacob said to Cheek, Jews don't think coffee beans are kosher for Passover, so why don't you write, or I'll have somebody write a Haggadah, and we'll put it right next to the coffee beans so people will know they are kosher for Passover, because beans are not kosher. General beans are not kosher for Passover, and then the rest is history of how Maxwell House was tied in and forever with Haggadahs and with Passover, and people felt comfortable having the coffee beans. But that's how the origin between this.
You know, it's an example of actually something that's very important in this sort of kosher story in America, which is that the kosher certification industry, the kosher certification agencies, helped sell industrial food to Jews. And the industries themselves, like Maxwell House, helped sell Yiddishkeit to Jews. So they were really, working for each other. So the Maxwell House Haggadah is a great example of how it is that the Orthodox Union tried to sell Maxwell House coffee to Jews, and the Maxwell House Food Company tried to sell Yiddishkeit to Jews. And they're really marketing two things to the same consumer base.
Yeah.
It's interesting. We're in New York State, and we know a lot of the assemblymen, and they say that Speaker Silver, who is an Orthodox Jew, and that means he keeps kosher, has done a tremendous amount of good for the kosher consumer. And I heard then, but you're the authority now, that there's just so much good regulation in New York State. We're talking about rabbis, but now we're going to the government. They have kosher supervisors. Could you address that, maybe that
Sure.
idea that, and also maybe the issue, because you are also a lawyer, you're a professor, about church and state. Sometimes people have brought that up. Hey, what's the state dealing with kosher? That's, like we were talking, that's rabbi job, not state job.
22 states in the United States have what are called kosher fraud laws. These are government laws that make it a crime to sell kosher food that's mislabeled. So food that's not kosher that has a kosher label on it. And most of these laws are modeled on the New York law, which was the first law in the 19-teens that was passed. And that law originally said that anything that is certified kosher has to meet Orthodox kosher standards, otherwise it's fraud, and if it's fraud, you can be prosecuted for it. So there are a number of things to keep in mind about these government attempts to regulate kosher. The first is that in many places, these laws are just laws on the books, nobody's enforcing them. So I had a research assistant call around, and he called the Consumer Affairs Division of the state of Arkansas, and he talked to the Chief Consumer Protection Officer in the state of Arkansas Attorney General's office. He said, I'm calling to ask about your enforcement of the kosher fraud law in Arkansas. And the Chief of Consumer Protection in the Attorney General's office in Arkansas said, we don't have such a law. And my research assistant said, well, actually, I'm looking at it on the computer in front of me. I pulled it up. And he said, yeah, and the student gave him the citation, and the assistant attorney general looked it up and he said, wow, I didn't know we did that. So many of these states have laws on the books, but they're not using them. The second thing to keep in mind
is important because it's got Chicken Tyson and other chickens and Walmart, yeah.
So the other thing to keep in mind is that despite the fact that many places don't do a lot of enforcement, the two states that actually have or used to have large enforcement operations were New York State and New Jersey. New York State used to have in its Department of Agriculture and Markets a kosher enforcement office or bureau.
Yeah.
Now they still have this, but it used to consist of a director, Rabbi Loser Weiss, and a staff of 10 specially trained kosher inspectors who would go around the state and they would do thousands of inspections each year of industrial facilities. In 2011, due to budget cuts at the state, they fired all of the 10 inspectors, and the only person left in that office is the director. And all of the inspectors are supposedly being taken over by food safety inspectors who are not specially trained in kosher and don't really know much about it. So most kosher enforcement in the industrial sector in New York State has really completely gone away. There's not very much going on. Loser Weiss is still trying to keep the operation going, and he's very knowledgeable and he works very well, but the level of inspection is no longer there. So the consumer in New York is protected pretty much only by private kosher supervision agencies, and the same is true in New Jersey.
Well, the answer to New York State wiping out the kosher food inspectors, these inspectors that were only going to look at kosher food industrial, which are industrial, okay? They were going to train all of the other inspectors who go around to the non-kosher ones how to do kosher inspections. So they're doing the kosher inspections, but not with a rabbi or not with someone who's...
But you're also talking about doing the kosher inspections by people who already have an enormous regulatory burden on their plate. They're in charge of food safety and all of the regulations in state and local government, as well as the federal statutes that they may be empowered to enforce as well. So they don't have a lot of time left over for kosher, and the level of state involvement really is diminished. And that's in New York State. So in most of the rest of the country, it's really completely non-existent. So The kosher food safety, the kosher certification system is a private system, and it's the private system that's protecting the consumer today. Now, the other question you asked about was the constitutionality of these various kosher fraud laws. And the fact of the matter is that the original formulation of these laws, that in order for something to be kosher, it has to conform to orthodox standards, is been declared in New Jersey, New York, and now in Georgia unconstitutional. The government, and in this case a judge, cannot be in the business of determining whether or not butcher shop X is abiding by orthodox standards or not. So if the butcher says, my stuff is kosher according to orthodox standards, and the rabbi or certification agency says it's not, a state official, like a judge, cannot weigh in on that issue, cannot say, well, the state of New Jersey or the state of New York says orthodox standards are X. That's a violation of church and state separation. That's a violation of the Establishment Clause and probably the Free Exercise Clause of the U.S. Constitution. So those laws have been struck down. They've been replaced by another kind of law that's no longer an orthodox standards law. It's what's called a disclosure law. If you say on your product, certified kosher by agency X, as long as you can produce the documentation that agency X has been around to inspect, the state says that's fine. So if you say, these pork chops are kosher and they're certified by my Aunt Minnie, and you have documentation that Aunt Minnie comes and she checks them out, and Aunt Minnie says pork chops are kosher, the state of New York has nothing to say about that.
Wow. Now that's bad, isn't it?
Well, I don't know if you think it's bad or good, but
Well,
I don't think we were
you.
ever getting a lot of protection from the state of New York before. I think that on the one hand, depending on your views of church and state, it's probably a good idea that the state of New York doesn't have an opinion that they can enforce in a court of law as to what the kosher standards ought to be for religious Jews or anybody else. And on the other hand, we get an enormous amount of protection from private agencies. So if you look in the book, I talk extensively about what the rate of kosher fraud is. And the data we have now is that the rate of kosher fraud is extremely small, and that is because of the reliability of these private certification agencies.
But who prosecutes for this fraud in New York State?
Nobody. We don't need state prosecutors to stop kosher fraud. We have agencies who do it.
We have private agencies
Yes.
that do it. But for example, we had Leo's Bakery here in Albany, and we had it was under the Vada Kosher. Now the state health department came in to Leo's Bakery, and they shut them down because they found droppings from mice and other animals in the bakery. And I went to the Mishkiach who oversaw Leo's, a small community, we know everyone, and I said, well, how come you didn't report this? I mean, for the sake of the community. Well, that's not what we do as a Mishkiach. That's not what we do. I said, but as a member of our community, why didn't you look to protect us? And he says, because that's not what I'm supposed to do. That wasn't part of my job. And then I asked other people, and they said, normally what we do at the VOD is that we tell the owner quietly, and we don't tell health department, let's say, but we tell the owner, and we expect that the owner picks it up and takes. But I'm shocked that when you talk about the private regulation, that falls apart. That doesn't really.
So let me just be clear. My book deals with a particular sector of the kosher
I
certification system.
I understand. I'm
And
giving you smaller.
That sector is the industrial
Yes.
packaged food sector.
Right.
There are also other areas of kosher certification, one of which is meat certification, another which is retail or food service certification, which is the example that you brought up. There's an enormous difference, which is in the industrial production section, you're talking about a system that has a widespread competition, where there's a tremendous amount of interconnection between the agencies, and I can talk about that more in a minute, and where there's a great deal of reliability and sophistication about management oversight. When you talk about retail or local food service establishments, you're talking about supervision that's done by a single authority that has competition from no one else, and it's a completely different system. It's a small, local, nonprofit that has a monopoly on kosher certification in the locality, and that's true all across the country. So you'll find relatively high rates of problems in restaurants or other food service establishments. But that's completely different than whether or not when you go into the supermarket and you buy canned soup or you buy cake mix, whether or not the certification on that canned soup or cake mix is reliable. And the analysis in the book suggests that it's actually very reliable.
Okay.
The reason for this, I think, is
Yeah, go ahead. We have a few more minutes. One more minute.
the reason for this is that once the kosher certification agencies convinced industrial food systems, the industrial food manufacturers, that kosher certification was a great marketing opportunity for them.
Yes.
They then had to convince them that it made a difference whose certification you got. The OU wanted to suggest that its certification was better than its competitors, and the other competitors want to suggest that theirs are. How do you do that? You have to make your certification more reliable. And the way they did that is instituting management controls and oversight within the institution, and also by professionalizing and giving greater levels of training. And you see in these agencies a much higher level of professionalization and management oversight and quality control to prevent fraud than you used to see in the old system and that you see now in the local system, because it's not as sophisticated in the retail sector.
Well, I got to thank you for writing this book. I mean, personally, I just learned a whole lot of information that I will carry with me in all my reporting endeavors in the future. But thank you very much for writing this.
Professor Lytton, thank you for dealing with the kosher consumer. It's a big service, not only with your professor for law, but of course for the Jewish consumer, the kosher consumer. We say is mainly not even Jewish anyway. But thank you very much for your service to the community.
And the book's name is Kosher, Private Regulation in the Age of Industrial Food. Go out, buy many copies.